Welcome to APUSH BLITZ, period 8.2, the Cold War. Get ready for new and match information. So we're going to begin the post-World War II foreign policy, which is really important to understand how the United States transitioned from a predominantly isolationist situation into a more internationalist foreign policy. By 1946, Moscow's hardline policies in Germany, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East wrought a psychological Pearl Harbor. We want to think about that for a moment, this idea of Pearl Harbor and the shock to the system that created in December of 1941. Most Americans were hoping to return to a more isolationist foreign policy. However, that would be not the case, which we talked about Stalin's ideas in Berlin and his denial of elections in Poland and so forth. So what would the United States do? If our days of isolationism were gone, how would we move forward? What would that look like? And how dangerous really was the Soviet Union, especially under the leadership of Joseph Stalin? President Truman would have to move carefully. It is clear the main element of any United States policy towards the Soviet Union must be that of a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. It is clear that the United States cannot expect in the foreseeable future to enjoy political intimacy with the Soviet regime, and must continue to regard the Soviet Union as a rival, not a partner in the political arena. Who said it? Well, that would be George Kennan. And we have to understand that George Kennan is a really important person in 8.2, especially in terms of change in U.S. foreign policy. So who was he? In brief, he was a Russian expert at the State Department. He had been in the Soviet Union during World War II, and he wrote a long telegram, as it was known, and later an article in Foreign Policy magazine recommending a new policy for the United States towards the Soviet Union. And that policy is a major must know, and that would be containment. Containment policy would be a hallmark of U.S. foreign policy throughout the Cold War. So when we think of the Containment Doctrine, we have to understand this is an attempt to contain Soviet aggression, contain the expansion of communism, just not in Europe, but throughout the world. And there were three early actions the Truman administration implemented that sent a very strong message to Stalin that the Western powers were done with appeasement. This is all taking place around 1947. And the first place we must start is the Truman Doctrine. So, two countries in Europe, Greece and Turkey, right there bordering the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, were under internal communist attack. And President Truman asked Congress for a $400 million aid package, which they approved. And this was to give military and economic support to both of those countries to, again, kind of cage in the Soviet Union and Europe, and especially to keep the Russians out of the Mediterranean Sea. A few weeks later, Secretary of State George Marshall pushed out a plan, today known as the Marshall Plan, to give economic aid to Western Europe, which would later be expanded, as you can see in the map, to other places. This was an economic-only package to rebuild the war-torn nations after World War II. Initially, the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries were offered money as well. However, Stalin rejected the money, which we believed he would do because that would tie him to capitalism. And as he was continuing to promote communist ideology and economic policies, that was something that he was not going to link himself with. So, over the course of 4 years, billions of dollars from the United States was sent to other nations to help rebuild infrastructure, hospitals, schools, and many other areas. All of these linking these nations to the United States. And the third policy, which had more a military aspect to it, would be the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, signed into existence in 1949. And this would create, for the United States, collective security, which is the hallmark of all three of these, really, to give strength to the United States moving forward. NATO is a military alliance, and really significant for the United States because this ends our precedent of no entangling permanent alliances, which goes all the way back to the Washington administration in the 1790s. So we see a huge change in the United States, especially in foreign policy in the years after World War II. So you can see the nations in the blue are the NATO states, and how it really is a barrier to the Soviet Union. And those countries in red would represent something called the Warsaw Pact, which a few years after the creation of NATO would be established, pretty much forced to establish by the Soviet Union, so that their satellite countries would be a counterweight to NATO. Now, along with supercharging our foreign policy, we actually had to put some, muscle behind all of this. It simply just couldn't be money and paper treaties. We had seen how that worked out in the 1930s. And so Congress at the same time also passed the National Security Act. And this was a major reorganization of military and many other foreign policy initiatives. And it starts with the National Security Council, which would be an addition to the executive branch, a group of advisors who would advise the president on national security measures. Also, the Air Force would be separated from the U.S. Army into its own branch of the military and would expand greatly as our bombers would have to be retrofitted for the future, and the new bomber of the Cold War, the B-52, a high-altitude bomber which could deliver huge payloads of explosives, including nuclear weapons. Also created permanently would be the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, which would be our spy agency that would have agents throughout the world to spy on the communists and the Soviet Union and to give recommendations to the president on how to proceed. And the CIA would gain strength and importance and size throughout the Cold War. And lastly, the Army and the Navy would be all put together. The War Department would be ended, and a new cabinet position known as the Department of Defense, or the Defense Department, would be established. And its new headquarters that was being built during World War II would be a symbol of American power and permanency, and as the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., a massive facility of the U.S. military. So collectively, all of these together were creating a foundation of American foreign policy and power throughout the Cold War. And the big word here is deterrence. Based on recommendations from George Kennan and others, the Soviets only respected power, and through a continual power could they hope to be contained. Thank you for listening.